Robert Walker never imagined that breaking into apartment 314 would change American counterintelligence forever. The crowbar slipped, glass shattered. Inside the wall safe, between stacks of cash he expected to find, sat rows of tiny film canisters marked with Cyrillic letters. His hands started shaking. This wasn't a jewelry collection. Something far worse. October 1979 marked the height of Cold War paranoia across the United States, a period when the Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained over 15,000 active surveillance operations against suspected Soviet intelligence networks operating within American borders. The agency had identified approximately 200 known KGB officers working under diplomatic cover in Washington, D.C. alone, but intelligence analysts estimated that for every identified officer, at least 3 undetected sleeper agents lived completely normal American lives while gathering intelligence and maintaining secret networks that could be activated during times of crisis. Arlington County, located directly across the Potomac River from the nation's capital, housed thousands of government employees, military contractors, and defense industry workers who commuted daily into secure facilities throughout the Washington metropolitan area, making it an ideal location for Soviet intelligence operations that required proximity to sensitive information without the intense scrutiny focused on addresses within the District of Columbia itself. Robert Walker had spent 8 years working as a camera equipment technician for a regional electronics retailer in Alexandria, Virginia, developing an intimate knowledge of photography gear that ranged from consumer-grade automatic cameras to professional medium-format systems used by commercial studios throughout the metropolitan area. His criminal record consisted of 2 petty theft convictions from his early 20s and 1 failed check fraud scheme that earned him 18 months in a minimum security facility, where he learned that quick cash came not from elaborate cons, but from identifying targets with valuable portable items and minimal security measures protecting their homes. Walker had spent 6 weeks surveilling the Colonial Arms apartment complex in Arlington after noticing that apartment 314 received regular deliveries of expensive photography equipment, the kind of gear that fetched premium prices from pawn shops and underground dealers, who asked no questions about provenance or ownership documentation. The occupant, a man who introduced himself to neighbors as Yuri Danilov and operated a small wedding photography business from his apartment, maintained a predictable schedule that involved weekend shoots at local venues and weekday processing sessions that kept him away from home for extended periods. Walker entered the building through the parking garage service entrance at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, wearing maintenance coveralls he had stolen from a commercial laundry service and carrying a toolbox that contained his bypass tools, tension wrenches, and the small crowbar he preferred for forcing window frames when lockpicking proved too time-consuming. The apartment's layout matched the floor plan he had memorized from a brief conversation with the building superintendent 3 weeks earlier, and the bedroom window facing the rear courtyard opened after 90 seconds of careful prying that produced minimal noise and left damage that could be explained as weathering or poor installation. Inside, Walker moved quickly through the small apartment, locating camera equipment worth at least $12,000 according to his professional assessment, but his attention focused immediately on the wall safe hidden behind a framed poster in the bedroom closet, the kind of installation that suggested contents far more valuable than the camera gear sitting openly on shelves throughout the apartment. The safe's combination lock resisted Walker's attempts at manipulation for nearly 40 minutes, leading him to make a decision that would later strike investigators as either remarkably stupid or unconsciously brilliant, depending on their perspective about fate's role in intelligence work. Walker retrieved a small quantity of commercial dynamite he had stolen 6 months earlier from a construction site, packed it around the safe's locking mechanism using techniques he had learned from a demolitions expert during his prison stint, and detonated the charge after stuffing towels around the doorframe to muffle the explosion. The blast destroyed the safe's lock completely and filled the apartment with acrid smoke that triggered the building's fire alarm system, but Walker ignored the blaring sirens and pulled open the safe's door to discover not the expected jewelry, bonds, or large currency reserves, but rather dozens of microfilm canisters organized in labeled boxes alongside 3 separate notebooks filled with handwritten entries in Russian. Walker grabbed 2 microfilm canisters at random and one notebook. Smoke filled the hallway outside. The fire alarm meant minutes before building security arrived. He stuffed the items inside his jacket. His heart hammered against his ribs. The Cyrillic letters on every label meant something terrifying, something that could get him killed. He ran for the window. Sirens grew louder outside. Police or fire trucks? Maybe both. His hands trembled as he climbed through. The notebook felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Robert Walker spent 3 days locked inside his basement apartment in Alexandria, trying to understand what he had stolen. Using a borrowed microfilm reader that he told the library equipment clerk he needed for genealogy research into his family's immigration records from Eastern Europe. The first canister contained approximately 800 individual frames, each displaying typewritten lists of names organized alphabetically with corresponding street addresses, workplace information, daily routine schedules, vehicle descriptions, and detailed notes about family members including the names and ages of children, all written in English despite the Cyrillic labels on the canister's exterior. The second canister held another 600 frames following identical formatting, and the notebook contained handwritten Russian text that Walker could not read but recognized as methodical record-keeping based on the consistent structure of entries that included dates, times, and what appeared to be numerical codes following each paragraph. Every name on the microfilms belonged to someone with Russian, Ukrainian, or other Slavic surnames, and many entries included notes about religious affiliations, political activities before emigration, and known associates within local immigrant communities throughout Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Walker recognized immediately that he possessed Soviet intelligence material, the kind of discovery that television news programs and political thrillers suggested would make him either a hero or a corpse, depending on how carelessly he handled the situation, and his criminal background meant that walking into a federal building to report the theft would likely result in immediate arrest for the burglary itself before anyone took his information seriously enough to examine the microfilms properly. He considered destroying the material and forgetting the entire incident, but the scope of the surveillance documented in just 2 canisters out of dozens he had seen in the safe suggested an intelligence operation far larger than anything he had read about in newspapers or heard discussed on radio programs covering Cold War tensions. The notebook's meticulous handwriting and the pristine condition of the microfilms indicated recent creation rather than archived historical material, meaning that whoever maintained this database remained actively operational and continued adding new subjects to the surveillance lists on a regular basis. Walker calculated that if 2 canisters contained 1,400 frames, documenting roughly 1,100 individuals, then the 30-plus canisters visible in the safe before the explosion likely contained comprehensive records on 15 to 20,000 people, a surveillance operation of staggering magnitude that exceeded anything Walker imagined possible for a single intelligence officer operating without apparent support staff or secure facility access. The realization that he possessed evidence of the largest domestic Soviet intelligence operation ever discovered on American soil created a profound dilemma for Walker that kept him awake for 72 consecutive hours while he compulsively reviewed the microfilm frames and tried to devise a method of reporting his discovery without spending the next decade in federal prison for burglary, theft, destruction of property, and illegal possession of explosives. His research into comparable cases revealed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained a system for confidential informants who could provide intelligence about ongoing criminal enterprises or threats to national security while receiving varying degrees of legal protection, depending on the value of information supplied and the informant's level of cooperation with subsequent investigations. Walker understood that his criminal record and the circumstances of his discovery would make him inherently untrustworthy in the eyes of federal agents, but he also recognized that the sheer volume and specificity of the surveillance data would force investigators to take the material seriously, regardless of their opinions about the source. He drafted and discarded 17 different versions of an anonymous letter explaining his discovery before settling on a concise note that provided just enough detail to establish credibility without revealing information that could identify him through writing style analysis or knowledge of specific details about the burglary. Walker mailed the letter from a post office in Silver Spring, Maryland, on Monday morning at 7:15, including a single microfilm frame showing 20 names as proof of the material's authenticity, and provided a dead drop location in Rock Creek Park, where he would deliver one complete canister if the FBI demonstrated genuine interest by placing a classified advertisement in the Washington Post using specific wording he outlined in the letter. The FBI's counterintelligence division received Walker's letter on Wednesday morning, immediately recognized the microfilm frame as genuine intelligence material based on the formatting and information density, and assigned a 6-agent task force to investigate the claim within 4 hours of the initial assessment. Special Agent Michael Robinson, a 15-year veteran who had worked Soviet counterintelligence operations since 1964, examined the microfilm frame and immediately noticed that several names listed matched known refugees from the Soviet Union who had received asylum in the United States during the previous decade, suggesting that the surveillance operation specifically targeted émigrés rather than conducting general intelligence gathering against random American citizens. Robinson placed the classified advertisement in the Thursday edition of the Washington Post, using Walker's exact wording. The dead drop in Rock Creek Park yielded one microfilm canister at the specified location Friday morning. The FBI team photographed Walker, making the drop from concealed positions 300 yards away. His face showed pure terror, hands shaking as he placed the canister, looking over his shoulder every 5 seconds. Robinson knew this man was no professional intelligence officer, just a terrified amateur who stumbled into something massive. The question was whether he understood how massive, whether he realized he had just handed over evidence of the most extensive KGB sleeper network ever documented on American soil, whether he knew that Yuri Danilov was not just one agent, but the keeper of secrets that reached into 24 American cities. Special Agent Michael Robinson confronted Robert Walker at a diner in Bethesda, Maryland, on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, sliding into the booth across from the terrified burglar and placing a manila folder containing 8x10 photographs of Walker entering and exiting the Colonial Arms apartment building on the table between them. The FBI had identified Walker within 18 hours of receiving the dead drop material by cross-referencing the photographic surveillance images against criminal databases containing individuals with known histories of burglary and theft in the Washington metropolitan area, and Robinson had spent the previous evening reviewing Walker's complete criminal record alongside psychological assessments prepared by bureau analysts who concluded that Walker possessed neither the ideological motivation nor the sophisticated tradecraft necessary to function as a genuine Soviet intelligence asset. Robinson offered Walker a straightforward arrangement that involved complete cooperation with the FBI's investigation into Yuri Danilov and the surveillance network documented in the microfilms in exchange for immunity from prosecution for all crimes committed during the burglary, including breaking and entering, theft, illegal possession of explosives, and destruction of property, contingent upon Walker providing detailed testimony about everything he saw in Danilov's apartment and surrendering all remaining material he had stolen from the safe. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Counterintelligence Division had maintained a file on Yuri Danilov since 1973, when routine surveillance of known Soviet intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover at the Embassy of the Soviet Union in Washington, D.C., revealed multiple meetings between a KGB officer using the cover name Vyacheslav Fedosiv and a wedding photographer operating a small business in Arlington County under the name Danilov Photography Services. The FBI's investigation into Danilov revealed an immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1964, claiming to be a Ukrainian refugee who fled Soviet control after his family suffered persecution during the Khrushchev era, and immigration records showed that Danilov received asylum status based on testimony he provided about conditions in Soviet Ukraine that matched information supplied by other refugees during the same period. Danilov established his photography business in 1966 using a small business loan from a community bank, married an American woman of Polish descent in 1968, and maintained a completely unremarkable public profile that involved photographing weddings, anniversary parties, and family portraits while living in a modest one-bedroom apartment and driving a 10-year-old sedan that required frequent repairs. The FBI's surveillance detected no suspicious activities during 6 years of intermittent observation, and analysts eventually classified Danilov as a possible false positive who maintained social connections with Soviet diplomatic personnel based on shared cultural background rather than active intelligence work. Robinson's analysis of the microfilm material revealed that the FBI's assessment of Danilov represented a catastrophic intelligence failure that allowed a highly sophisticated sleeper agent to operate undetected while constructing the most comprehensive surveillance database of Soviet émigrés ever discovered outside the KGB's Moscow headquarters. The microfilms documented surveillance of 11,237 individuals across 17 states, with particularly dense concentrations in metropolitan areas including Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And every subject profile included information that could only be obtained through sustained physical surveillance, including daily commute routes, preferred shopping locations, religious service attendance patterns, social connections within émigré communities, and detailed notes about political opinions expressed during conversations in restaurants, community centers, and private homes. The surveillance notes included specific details about subjects who had participated in anti-Soviet political activities before emigrating, individuals who maintained contact with family members still living in Soviet-controlled territories, and emigrants who worked in sensitive industries including defense contracting, government service, and scientific research facilities. Robinson recognized immediately that the database served not as a tool for recruiting intelligence assets or gathering secrets about American military capabilities, but rather as a targeting list for future operations against individuals the Soviet government viewed as political enemies or potential sources of anti-Soviet propaganda. The FBI activated a priority surveillance operation against Danilov that involved round-the-clock observation by rotating teams of agents who documented every movement the photographer made during a 72-hour period following Walker's cooperation agreement. Danilov maintained his normal business schedule throughout Monday and Tuesday, photographing a small wedding in Fairfax County and processing film at a commercial laboratory in Alexandria. But surveillance teams noticed that Danilov made 3 separate telephone calls from public payphones rather than using his apartment telephone, suggesting that he suspected compromise of his communications or maintained operational security protocols that involved avoiding traceable connections. Robinson obtained authorization for wiretaps on Danilov's apartment telephone and initiated procedures for arresting the photographer on espionage charges, but bureau leadership decided to delay the arrest for 1 week in hopes that Danilov would lead investigators to other members of his network or attempt to contact his KGB handlers in ways that would reveal additional intelligence officers operating in the Washington area. Wednesday evening at 7:30, surveillance teams observed Danilov loading 4 large equipment cases into his sedan and driving to a storage facility in Springfield, Virginia, where he maintained a rental unit that FBI records showed he had leased for 6 years, but visited only 8 times during the previous 12 months according to facility access logs. Teams followed him inside. He opened Unit 217, started loading the equipment cases inside, then stopped, stared at the lock mechanism. Someone had been inside the unit. The scratches on the lock were fresh. Danilov dropped the cases, ran back to his car. Agents moved to intercept. He saw them coming, reached for something inside his jacket. Robinson shouted for him to freeze. Danilov's hand came out holding not a weapon, but a small black notebook, the same type Walker had stolen. He tore out pages, started chewing them, swallowing evidence before anyone could stop him. Special Agent Michael Robinson spent 11 hours interrogating Yuri Danilov in a secure facility at the FBI's Washington field office, watching the photographer systematically dismantle his own carefully constructed legend as a Ukrainian refugee while explaining the operational parameters of a surveillance network that stretched across the continental United States and represented 15 years of meticulous intelligence work. Danilov had entered the United States in 1964 as a legitimate refugee fleeing Soviet persecution, but KGB officers approached him during his first month in New York City and offered him a choice between returning to the Soviet Union, where his elderly parents would face immediate arrest as enemies of the state, or remaining in America as a sleeper agent who would spend years building a cover identity while waiting for activation orders that might never arrive. The KGB trained Danilov in basic surveillance techniques, provided him with funding to establish the photography business that would serve as his operational cover, and assigned him a single mission that would consume the next 15 years of his life while operating in complete isolation from other Soviet intelligence assets working in the United States. His mission involved creating a comprehensive database documenting the locations, routines, and vulnerabilities of Soviet emigrants who had fled to America and publicly criticized the Soviet government, spoken out about human rights abuses, or provided testimony to Western intelligence services about conditions inside Soviet-controlled territories. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's analysis of Danilov's complete microfilm archive revealed a surveillance operation of unprecedented scope that documented 11,237 Soviet emigrants across 17 states, with particularly detailed files on 312 individuals classified by the KGB as high-priority targets based on their public anti-Soviet activities, media appearances, published writings, or connections to Western intelligence agencies. Danilov explained that his handlers never explicitly stated the database's ultimate purpose, but operational security protocols required him to include specific categories of information in each subject profile that clearly indicated preparation for future violence, including home security measures, daily routine predictability, family member schedules, and identified windows of vulnerability when subjects were isolated or traveling alone. The photographer described meeting his primary handler, a KGB officer, working under diplomatic cover named Vyacheslav Fedoseev, approximately 4 times per year at rotating locations throughout the Washington metropolitan area, where he delivered updated microfilm canisters and received new target assignments, alongside operational funds that supplemented his legitimate photography income. Danilov maintained the database using a sophisticated microfilm production system installed in his storage unit that allowed him to photograph updated surveillance logs and subject profiles using high-resolution film stock, and his handler provided him with specialized equipment including telephoto lenses, parabolic microphones, and miniature cameras disguised as ordinary consumer products that enabled covert surveillance without arousing suspicion from subjects or law enforcement. Robinson recognized that Danilov's cooperation provided an unprecedented opportunity to dismantle not just a single sleeper agent, but an entire network of operatives working in coordination across multiple American cities, and the FBI offered Danilov a comprehensive immunity agreement that would spare him from prosecution for espionage in exchange for his complete cooperation in identifying every member of his surveillance network and providing testimony that would enable the arrest and prosecution of his KGB handlers. Danilov revealed that his operation represented only one component of a larger KGB initiative codenamed Operation Reckoning that involved 23 separate sleeper agents, each maintaining similar surveillance databases in different American cities, while operating under deep cover identities that appeared completely legitimate to neighbors, business associates, and local law enforcement agencies. Each sleeper agent operated independently, without direct knowledge of other network members, receiving instructions and delivering intelligence only through their assigned handlers who worked under diplomatic immunity at Soviet consulates and embassy facilities throughout the United States. The network's structure ensured that compromise of any single agent would not expose the entire operation, but Danilov possessed unique knowledge of the network's scope because his handlers accidentally revealed operational details during a meeting in 1976, when they discussed the logistical challenges of coordinating surveillance across multiple cities and maintaining consistency in database formatting across different agents. The FBI launched Operation Lighthouse on November 1, 1979, deploying over 200 special agents in coordinated raids that simultaneously targeted 19 sleeper agents operating in 12 cities, including New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Miami, Atlanta, Houston, and Phoenix, resulting in 17 arrests and the seizure of microfilm archives documenting surveillance of over 73,000 Soviet emigrants living throughout the United States. The operation represented the largest counterintelligence success in FBI history, dismantling a surveillance network that the KGB had spent 2 decades constructing and that Soviet leadership had intended to activate during future periods of heightened Cold War tensions when the assassination of prominent Soviet dissidents living in exile would serve strategic propaganda purposes. 4 sleeper agents escaped arrest by fleeing to Soviet diplomatic facilities, where they claimed asylum and received immediate evacuation to Moscow. But the remaining 17 agents cooperated with FBI interrogators and provided detailed testimony about KGB operational procedures, training methods, and intelligence priorities that fundamentally changed American understanding of Soviet intelligence operations on domestic soil. Danilov's cooperation with the FBI extended beyond identifying network members to include detailed testimony about his handlers' operational procedures, communication protocols, and the specific KGB department responsible for managing sleeper agent networks in North America. His information enabled the FBI to identify 12 Soviet intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover who managed various aspects of Operation Reckoning, and the State Department declared all 12 officers persona non grata in December 1979, forcing their immediate departure from the United States and severely disrupting KGB intelligence operations that depended on their expertise and established networks. The Soviet government responded with reciprocal expulsions of American diplomats from Moscow and issued public statements denying any involvement in surveillance operations against Soviet emigrants. But intelligence analysts recognized that the exposure of Operation Reckoning represented a strategic defeat that would require years of effort to rebuild comparable surveillance capabilities on American soil. The microfilm archives seized during Operation Lighthouse provided American counterintelligence services with comprehensive documentation of KGB targeting priorities, surveillance methodologies, and operational security procedures that informed defensive measures protecting Soviet emigrants and enhanced detection capabilities for identifying future sleeper agent networks. The Department of Justice negotiated a plea agreement with Yuri Danilov that acknowledged his cooperation in dismantling Operation Reckoning and recognized the coercive circumstances under which the KGB recruited him as a sleeper agent through threats against his family members living in Soviet Ukraine. Danilov pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit espionage, received a sentence of time served plus 5 years probation, and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program under a new identity that relocated him to a small city in the Pacific Northwest, where he resumed working as a commercial photographer while living under permanent FBI supervision. The Justice Department's decision to offer Danilov leniency generated controversy within intelligence community circles, where hardliners argued that any Soviet agent operating on American soil deserved maximum punishment regardless of cooperation value. But Bureau leadership maintained that Danilov's intelligence windfall justified the agreement and that his testimony would prove invaluable in future prosecutions of other Soviet intelligence operatives. Danilov provided testimony in 6 separate espionage trials between 1980 and 1984, helping secure convictions against Soviet handlers and American citizens who collaborated with KGB operations, and he maintained regular contact with FBI debriefers who used his insights into KGB operational thinking to develop training programs for counterintelligence agents working Soviet cases throughout the 1980s. Robert Walker received complete immunity from prosecution as promised and spent 3 months working with FBI analysts who used his detailed observations about Danilov's apartment contents to reconstruct aspects of the surveillance operation that might have been lost if the photographer had succeeded in destroying additional evidence before his arrest. The FBI paid Walker $75,000 for his cooperation, a sum that represented compensation for his assistance with the investigation rather than any formal informant payment, and Bureau officials quietly arranged for Walker's burglary conviction records to be sealed to protect his identity from potential Soviet retaliation. Walker used the payment to relocate to Denver, Colorado, where he enrolled in community college courses, and eventually earned certification as an aviation mechanic, finding legitimate employment at a regional airport facility that provided stable income without the constant financial pressure that had driven him toward property crime. He maintained irregular contact with Special Agent Robinson for 5 years following Operation Lighthouse, occasionally providing updates about his civilian life and expressing persistent amazement that his botched burglary had contributed to dismantling the largest Soviet surveillance network ever discovered on American soil. Robinson retired from the FBI in 1992 after serving 28 years with the Bureau, having spent the final decade of his career training new counterintelligence agents in surveillance detection and sleeper agent identification techniques that drew heavily on lessons learned from Operation Lighthouse. He testified before congressional committees in 1997 about the enduring threat posed by foreign intelligence services operating on American soil. The case file remained classified until 2003. His testimony helped shape legislation expanding FBI counterintelligence authorities. Walker and Danilov never met again after that Saturday morning in Bethesda. Two men whose lives intersected for one chaotic week in October 1979. One a burglar who stumbled into history, the other a reluctant spy who bought his freedom with secrets. Both lived quietly until the end. Walker died in Denver in 2019 at age 73. Danilov passed away in Oregon in 2021 at 84. Neither man's obituary mentioned the night that changed American counterintelligence forever.